think the really important thing to think about when you think about these mass nouns that describe these qualities, they all are, they result in kind of a democratization of data collection. So what I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to show you is work that can be done by communities at very low cost. And so part of what we do at my lab is try to develop these kinds of technologies and their approaches so that they are accessible, that they're low cost, and people can go out and essentially start collecting data for themselves, which they wouldn't have been able to do previously. So first I want to talk about immediacy, and this is that idea of being able to address something right away. So in the context of storms, that's like being able to go right out afterwards and see what happened. It's a very different context for me. Normally, I'm actually working in a different environment. So you can imagine yourself on a small boat in the Antarctic, and your job is you're there to try and measure whales. They're there at the surface very briefly, but you have a drone that within 5 minutes you can get up and collect really amazing information. And I actually wanted to put the whale story in, a little bit because it's exciting and interesting and a little bit positive. But I also put it in for Andy because he's been so traumatized. I wanted to put a little whale stuff in for him first, but he left knowing I was going to show these horrible pictures of the Marine Lab, and so he's going to miss out. But here's that context for me, right? We're able to put up a drone in the Antarctic, and we're able to have an interaction with an animal from a completely new perspective, right? This is something that is hardly ever seen. So here's a whale. It's actually got a tag on it. So think about this is an animal that we hunt, right? Not us, but humans hunt. And we've just put a tag on its back, and it has come back now, and it's investigating us and checking us out. Okay, and so this gives you that sense of perspective that's new when it comes to drones. And so here the whale's approaching me, and bad krill breath, I'm telling you right there. So anyways, this is a good example of the power of drones. We can do a lot of amazing things. In this same session, we were able to measure that whale photogrammetrically, so we know its body condition. We're able to identify individuals and study their behavior. It's a really amazing tool. So here's the sort of more sad data. This is a little bit of data actually collected by my lab by Mayor Rhett Newton a couple days right after the storm. And it provides some perspective on what happened to the Marine Lab during Florence. So the drone's taking up into the air. We're going to see that camera's going to pan down in a second, and we're going to get a good look at some of the roof structures that were damaged by the storm. So you can see almost all of the buildings at the Marine Lab had some form of roof damage, and you can see the damage to the roof, but you can also see what happened with all the stuff that was lifted off and distributed into the environment. Thousands and thousands and thousands of shingles everywhere, right? Incredible damage. But what's really amazing is this data was collected right after the storm. We were able to take that data, put it online, transmit that to Central Duke, and give them a perspective on how things had been affected by the storm, right? And so this is a really powerful tool to be able to assess damage. And it's very simple to do. And people can do this for themselves in these situations if they know how to do it. And it's not hard. So that gives you an idea of the power of drones in that context. We can also take that into the next stage and actually do some mapping so that we can do some quantitative things, right, to be able to try and understand how the Marine Lab, in this case, when we think about potential community, and how it responded. And so it's a map that was produced from a drone flight right after the Marine Lab, but after the response had started. And you can see, when we zoom in on things, you can see tarps on the roof, you can see boats that are actually stuck into the docks, and you can see a lot of damage. And I want to show you, if I can, what this data really looks like. And so I'm going to go online and show you how much detail we can generate on this kind of map. And so here's that same map, and let's take a zoom in on the roof of the Repast Center, one of our buildings. And so this is a building that had a solar roof on the east side, which would be on your right, and that roof the solar panels had actually been lifted off the roof and deposited on the green roof side of the building. And so this information is fantastic, right? We can give this to people who are going to go into that space and have to work on those things, right? provide information about the potential hazards. We can go ahead and actually even measure things, right? So it's all done in a geospatial context. We can measure an area of roof that was damaged, right? If you know the pitch of the roof, you could be quite accurate about that. But that's 205 meters squared, right? So we can use these tools to understand what's happening in that space. We can also do some really interesting point of view stuff to be able to share people perspectives. So you can put a drone up and you can actually collect a 3D panorama, right? And provide people in other places an opportunity to inspect what's going on and really understand those things. And this is all done right after the storm. That mapping flight took 20 minutes, and then it took 2 hours to process, and it was instantly online and available for people to be able to look at. So very powerful set of technologies. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit. When we think about immediacy, we can also think about the changes to the environment, right? So communities are also reliant on ecosystem services. We've talked a lot about that today. And this is a little video that actually can show you what a barrier island, in this case Bird Shoal, which protects the marine lab from the ever-widening Beaufort Inlet. And it shows you what it looks like after a hurricane. And so the drone is actually flying now over that area, and you can see waves propagating across the top of this strand and taking sand off the front and depositing it in the back. It's like classic barrier island dynamics. And so this is really helpful for us to understand how storms affect these locations. And the nice thing about immediacy is that it kind of pushes us maybe a little bit past just detecting change into actually understanding process, right? So because we can fly right afterwards, we can understand what the input was and what the result was in a maybe a clearer way. You can see a lot of the reserve has been inundated, and as the drone gets over the land part here, it's going to zip around. You can see the Marine Lab on the right-hand side there. Hope nobody's getting motion sick. But as it comes around, it's going to shift into the photogrammetric data that we collect. And so while we do these drone flights, we're collecting imagery with high overlap, and then we do massive stereo photogrammetry to be able to reconstruct the 3D surface of this area. So that allows us to be able to estimate how much elevation change occurred with this storm. And we know, using really great GPS systems, we know that we can be accurate in this way within 5 centimeters in both X, Y, and vertical dimensions. So if there's a 5 centimeter change, we would be able to detect that in these places. So if we take a look at some of those data, so at the bottom on the left here is a map of the reserve right across from the Duke Marine Lab with these sites labeled A, B, and C. And on the right are maps of change. So this is of before the storm and then after the storm, basically just subtracting one from the other. And where you see red, that's areas where a meter of elevation was lost, okay? And where you see really dark green is where a meter of elevation was gained. And so we're able to see how storms affect these locations. And our ongoing work it has revealed to us that these areas breathe, right? So we have a very large insult, but then the system recovers to a certain extent. Not completely, but we're seeing this now as we continue to work in these places, right? So this allows us to understand a lot about the habitats in those places and how they might be changing in response to these powerful disturbances. And the other thing that we're working on now is transitioning from using just aerial drones to using other small robotic platforms to be able to do other kinds of sampling. So Lee was talking about being able to go and sample in certain places, and he got to a spot and they had to wade out. They couldn't even get to the river. And so we can use drones to be able to fly over those places and using thermal imagery and hyperspectral imagery start to understand a little bit about the pollution in those places. But we can also put autonomous boats in the water that go and do in situ sampling. We can program them to go and sample in places that you don't want to go to, that aren't safe, right? That we can have the robots go and do that for us. And so this is one of the things that we're doing now. So that gives us greater access. We can do precision sampling, know exactly where we're working, and we can do that and increase people's safety. Here's an example. This is a project that Shane Hooley was an NC State undergraduate student who's been working with us for the past year. And this is a new platform. This is a autonomous boat system that's got inflatable sponsons. So you can, and basically a little aluminum frame So you can pack it into a truck, you can go to a place, foot pump up those sponsons, and you've got this really capable autonomous boat. This is a system that we're going to be using to do water quality testing in the marshy areas around Beaufort in the coming years. So it's very cool stuff. All right, so kind of thinking a little bit more about safety, I want to talk now about maybe a little bit more about going forwards and how we can think about safety. So again, bringing it back to my context, we worry about having to work in occupied aircraft. There's one paper that's been published on this. This guy, Benjamin Sass, he published a paper in 2003 that compiled information about mortalities of wildlife biologists from 1937 to 2000, and 66% of those were aviation related. So in my context, we use occupied aircraft to study animals or habitats, and it can be dangerous. And the picture here juxtaposes a helicopter that would normally have 4 people in it, flying over a coastal area in the wintertime, versus a little tiny foam airplane that we can throw in the air and do as good of work, if not better, right? So we have a really great opportunity there. And almost everyone I know knows someone who's had a problem with occupied aircraft. And the picture here is a colleague of mine in Hawaii who was working on some endangered birds and had a helicopter malfunction, 90-second free fall, hit the mountain, rolled down the mountain in the helicopter. They all walked away. But she's really interested in using drones now. All right, so I'm going to take you back now to that. Here's that rooftop of our repast center, and you can see where the roof had been lifted off and deposited on the green roof. And someone was talking about debris, right? And I think this was in the context of some of the aquaculture stuff. And the one thing you can see in the picture is that there is a lot of debris that's actually pushed up onto the island. And so that's actually really valuable information because it tells you how far the water came up, right? So now we know how far the storm surge came up onto the island, right? So that's a really cool bit of information. So we know that we can predict storm surge. So Rick Ludick's AdCirc model, the Resilience Center at UNC, does a great job. This is actually what that Florence risk map looked like. And there's the data. We saw this data earlier on where we had a 5.5 foot storm surge right at Beaufort, right where our marine lab is. And so we can now connect up how far the water came up onto the island with what was predicted and what was measured to try and get an understanding of what that landscape looks like in terms of risk. And so this is actually work that an MEM student that's coming into our program did as part of our drone class this summer. And Joanna's actually here. She's sitting over there. And so we gave her the data, and she's gone through and she's digitized this area where the storm surge came up to, and then was able to extract elevation data from our 3-dimensional models of the Marine Lab campus to be able to create maps that show where the Marine Lab is vulnerable to storm surge, right? So now we know how far water might come up, and we can link that to these predictions, and then we can use that information to help understand how storms and sea level rise are going to affect this place. And so I hope that this is actually the beginning of a really nice project that looks at how vulnerable the Marine Lab is to storms, right? And how we can use these kinds of technologies to be able to facilitate that. So that is all I'm going to say for now, but I'm happy to take any questions.
So yeah, drones are very cool. Thank you for all these photos. And you mentioned that anybody can use this, but really, can anyone use it? I guess my question is, are you aware of any programs that would make drones available in areas that might traditionally not be able to get them? I mean, you've got them for your facility, but what about some of these other areas that we've heard about today?
Yeah, so I think the shorter answer is that yes, it's actually very accessible technology. It's not very expensive, and it's actually quite feasible for people to be able to go and become a commercial drone operator license. You can sit a test, and if you study for a few days, you would be able to do that, and then you need to fly and practice. But yeah, it's an incredibly accessible technology, and it's becoming increasingly so. So I don't know how many communities have access to drones within their emergency response groups. I do know a lot of people are enthusiasts and have those drones and would be able to do these things quite simply. And I think it's really, one of those things that's emerging now as a very democratizing technology. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer for you how many places have access to them, but I do know that they're increasingly being used across the country to do exactly this at very low cost.
I had a related question.
Yeah.
It seems that...
Not on.
Yeah, it seems this would be a great tool for small towns and isolated communities to inexpensively get quick information. Is that the right read of this technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where I think it's going to go. And I think a lot of people come in with the perception that drones are toys. But I just showed you, like, for using something that costs about $600, you can fly over a set of buildings and assess the damage from a storm and transmit that information very efficiently to people who can help. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely more than just a toy.
So I think part of the barriers is not just the technology and learning how to operate it, but the data analysis and capacity to do the data analysis quickly and turning that in, knowing the software, but also knowing how to use the tools to make decisions. Do you know of any programs that exist to have technical assistance in that area, either for state or local governments?
Yeah, so I don't know if there are any programs that are set up to do that. I do know that there are lots of community colleges now that teach drones both for piloting and for data assessment. And a lot of the analysis tools that you would be interested in are usually, they're open source or freely downloadable to be able to work with. And so I think if you have access to a computer, you would be able to look at the video. And if you have access to a computer, you would probably be able to make a map as well.
I guess I can speak up. Are you working to democratize this technology?
Yeah.
Or are you just waiting for it to be democratized?
No, so it's a really, really great question. Yeah, and so we are. So we've worked in different contexts to do that. So we do local outreach. We work on developing programs for STEM sort of pathways in that area. We've also run workshops for groups of people who have needs, in terms of natural resource assessments. For example, I've run a couple workshops with my colleagues at the Marine Lab with First Nations people in Canada that want a court case to be able to manage their own fisheries. Part of that is being able to map out the resource. They can't afford to buy an airplane, but they can actually afford to buy some very low-cost drones and map out those resources, right, and understand their productivity and do those things. So we are in the context that we work in, absolutely.
We've seen some environmental organizations, Waterkeeper Alliance, who have had to fly planes in the post-storm periods to assess coal ash ponds or large factory farm operations to see what kind of damage may or may not have been done without relying on regulators who might not be able to get on site to those places. I think we're seeing drones used more and more, but from a democratization standpoint, the Department of Environmental Quality has been reluctant to use the information from Waterkeeper to actually enforce laws that have been documented to have been broken because they didn't collect that information themselves. Is that a challenge that you've seen or that you have thoughts about overcoming in order to truly make this something that other communities could use to protect their communities and the environment?
Yeah, so we haven't seen that. And in our context, we're mostly working in places where there aren't a lot of people and where those things aren't challenging because we don't have private property issues. There's a number of things like that. So we've worked with an environmental law clinic to to work on some of these issues about the legality of using them in a regulatory context. And I think we're getting some resolution on that. But we need to do a lot of work to try and understand those things, the legal side of things and the ethical side of things. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges. The technology is advancing so quickly. It's outpacing policy and regulation. And so, yeah, we need to do a lot more work in that area to be able to do it. But I really feel that is where things are going. The technology is affordable, it's relatively easy to use, and you can collect amazing data.